Mike, you have so you have a PhD in where you have studied the historicity of the life and death of Jesus. How come that you became interested in this field? Will you just tell us something about your background and where you are now?
Well, thanks for having me, Jesper, and it's good to join you all. When I was in Sweden a few years ago, I just very much enjoyed my trip to Sweden and Denmark. And I don't travel around the world often, but there are some countries that I would love to return to, and Sweden is certainly one of them. What got me interested in this was I was in grad school back in 1985, and I began having doubts about my Christian faith. And it wasn't anything necessarily that I was learning. It was more of, I've been brought up a Christian. Christianity is the only religion for which I have been exposed. If I'd been born in Afghanistan, would I be a Muslim? If I'd been born in India, would I be a Hindu? If I'd been born in China or France, would I be an atheist? I believed I had a relationship with the Lord. At that point in graduate school, I was studying scriptures several hours a day, and I was praying, an hour to 2 hours a day and loving it. And I felt very close to God. But I had to ask myself the question, had I brainwashed myself? Had I convinced myself of something that wasn't really true? And so that started to bother me because I got thinking, well, if Christianity is not true, I don't want to devote my life to spreading its message. If another religion is true, I want to know that it's true so that I can follow it, another religion or another worldview. If atheism is true, then I wanted to be an atheist. So a friend of mine, a roommate actually, referred me to a philosophy professor named Gary Habermas, a Christian philosopher. I had never met Habermas. I wasn't in the philosophy program. I was in New Testament program. And so I went to his office and he sat down, asked me to come in and sit down. And he said, there are a lot of people who have doubts. Don't feel bad about that. He said, here's why I think Christianity is true. And he began to give me some of the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And any kind of possible objection that I would bring up, he had a ready answer for it. Now, it just so happens that Gary Habermas is the #1 authority in the world on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So I was talking to a great scholar here. Well, by the time I left his office, which was probably 20 minutes to half an hour later, I was feeling confident about my faith once again. After I finished my coursework for my master's degree, I returned home. I would continue to talk every once in a while to skeptics and share my faith with them, but they were bringing up objections and I had no idea how to answer them. Up to that point, I really had no interest in Christian apologetics. I just wanted to study scripture, maintain and grow in my relationship with God. I just didn't need any evidence, but then I needed it because I started to doubt my Christian faith again. And I know, there are people who would say, well, yeah, you just have to have faith. My dad was one of them who would say that to me. But I said, well, that's not good enough. I need some evidence. And fortunately, Gary Habermas was patient with me, and I'd call him. We didn't have email back then. This was in the late 1980s now. And I would just ask him questions and he would refer me to books and I'd start reading stuff. And what interested me in the resurrection of Jesus is that I could study the scientific evidence for a creator of the universe. And that would establish that some sort of intelligent being existed that was responsible for the universe, like God. But it wouldn't show the Christian God. It could be the Muslim God. It could be a generic God. the Jewish God of the Old Testament, but apart from Jesus. It could have also been any number of kinds of gods, or even polytheism. So it wouldn't establish the truth of Christianity. But what fascinated me about the resurrection of Jesus, if Jesus actually rose from the dead, then God exists and Christianity is true. It's almost like you kill two birds with one stone. So that got me interested in it, and I started to study it more and more. I did, excuse me, did my master's thesis on it, and then I enrolled in a Ph.D. program to study it even further. And that resulted in a very large 700 and some page book on the resurrection that Habermas now says he thinks it's the best book ever written on the subject. Now that's it. He's in the process of writing a 5,000 page treatment on the resurrection. So mine will be a very abbreviated version of his. And by the way, that book has now been translated into Spanish and Korean. So it's helped a lot of people. It helped me. And so, yeah, that's how I got interested in the topic.
So in one way, we are living in an interesting time when we can find, when you speak about evidence and you speak about faith, when we can find historical arguments for the Christian faith. Could you say something about the difference between faith? One could think of, if we assume that Christianity is true, when the first disciples in the congregation in Jerusalem lived, they have very close connection with the death and resurrection of Jesus. But with time, that distance increased, and during the Middle Ages, they neither had the historical subject to investigate things, nor any eyewitnesses to the death and resurrection of Jesus, but still they believed in Jesus. But now we are in, I think, a fortunate situation where we can investigate what has happened in history and do some claims about what is true and what is not true. So could you say something about faith and arguments for faith and the difference between those things?
Sure. I don't see faith as a blind act. I think it is something that involves action. So Peter, in the Gospel of Matthew, he sees Jesus walking on water and he says, "Command that I come out." And Jesus says, "Well, come." And he walks, and he's beginning to walk on water. So he saw Jesus doing it. He knew Jesus could do it. He knew Jesus had the power to do it. But he gets out on the water and he began to doubt. The Greek word is distadzo, which means to think two different things. And so Peter is out on the water and he's thinking, "Hey, this is pretty neat. I like this. This is really wild. I'm actually walking on water." But then he sees the waves, the wind blowing up, and he's thinking, but how can this be? You can't really walk on water, and what if I sink? So he's thinking two things and he begins to sink. And Jesus says, "Why did you doubt?" Well, he was thinking two things. He had faith because he saw Jesus walking on water. He had evidence there that Jesus could do these kinds of things, but he began to sink because he had fear. I think the same can happen with us. We have faith. We've got evidence. We can look at all the evidence. Well, let me put it this way. I speak a lot at conferences, and so I'll be up on a stage And at many conferences where they have a big stage, sometimes the media crew, audio visual crew will put little pieces of glow in the dark tape on the stage. So, and they'll tell me, these are the boundaries where you can walk. If you go past these pieces of tape, the lights won't be shining on you. So you have to stay within bounds. And usually, I'll have 20, 25 feet, maybe 30 feet, maybe even more that I can walk from left to right. And I might have 15 to 20 feet from front to back. That's a lot of space. It's so much so that I could go from left to right. I could walk backwards and have no problem. I could run backward. I could close my eyes and walk backward. I could go forward and do cartwheels, although I wouldn't try that now. But I could do that and never go outside of where those tape marks are. But let's say you take something around the same size, maybe 15 to 20 feet wide, and rather than 25 feet long, let's put it at 100 yards, and let's suspend it between two skyscrapers, two buildings that are 50 stories above the ground, 50 floors above the ground, and say, all right, Mike, I want you to walk across that now. You can have your eyes open, you can walk as slowly as you want, but I want you to walk across it. Well, I'm not going to want to do that. You say, well, wait a minute, you can do it. Yep, I know I can. There's no problem. I could do it on the ground. I'd have no problem doing that in the air. Well, why don't you want to do it 50 stories, 50 floors up? Well, because in my mind, I'd be thinking, what if I fell? And it's like, well, yeah, but I don't have to fall. I know, because I could do it. In my mind, I know I could cross there very easily without falling. But there's that nagging question that says, but what if I fall? The consequences are too frightening. And so therefore, I wouldn't want to cross. So I think it's the same when it comes to faith. We can have all this evidence. We've got really good evidence that Jesus existed, a lot of the things that he taught, that he died, that he rose from the dead, that he performed miracles. We've got really good evidence for that, historical evidence. But we get thinking, yeah, but what if we're wrong? And then we start asking what about other religions? Well, what about them? They don't have anything like the kind of good historical evidence for the truth of that religion like we have. All they can do is do but what if? What if? We can answer most of the objections against Christianity, but there's always that nagging question that says, but I could be wrong. So that would be a difference, a relation between evidence and faith. Faith is not just believing, it's acting upon that belief. So Judas, he believed, he saw Jesus do all the miracles, but he did not in the end act upon that by following Jesus. You had the young rich man who came to Jesus and said, I followed all these commandments from the beginning. And Jesus says, well, you just lack one. Sell all that you have, give to the poor, come follow me. And he wouldn't do it. So he could believe that Jesus possessed the answer and could give eternal life, but he didn't have faith. He didn't put that into action. And on a more practical level, all of us at some point are faced with temptations of various sorts. Let's say you're having a bad marriage and you find another girl that you're attracted to and you're getting along really well, and you're thinking, well, I could have an affair here. This is going to result in my divorce. And you're thinking, but this would be sin to do it. Well, now maybe you even want to do it and you're willing to pay the price of a divorce. But you're thinking, but it would be sin. This would displease God. Well, now you're faced with something. And now you could say, yeah, but I'm not sure Christianity's true, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. But if you have faith, you would look and say, Christianity is true. I can't prove it 100%. I can't say I have 100% confidence, but it seems to me it's true, and I better follow it. And so you live the Christian life in holiness, and you resist the temptation to have an affair because you know it would displease God. That's faith. It's acting out your belief. It's not just merely saying, all right, I believe, and then living your life as you want. It's acting out that belief. That seems to be what faith is in the New Testament.
Mm. Mm. So we can know everything about Jesus and his life and death and resurrection, but we need to
Not
have
everything, but
okay, but we
we can
could
know
a lot
quite
of
a
stuff.
bit.
Yeah, yeah. But it's a difference between knowing the facts and have a living relationship with him, acting on the faith that you say. That's true. That's true. If we start with the broadest perspective and just look at Jesus as a person, the historical Jesus, I think many people doesn't really know how well it is established that Jesus, as a historical person, was alive, or the support that we have for that. Could you say something about just knowing that Jesus is a man of history?
Sure. Usually, hardly anyone will question whether Jesus existed. But every 100 years or so, you'll get a group of people who will raise the question and say, yeah, maybe he never existed. And that's going around right now. And it's usually not scholars who are raising it. It's, you'll have some scholars every once in a while who raise the question. But as it stands today, you might have not even a dozen qualified scholars in the world who would question whether Jesus existed. In fact, the leading proponent of the Jesus myth is a guy named Richard Carrier, and he's a bona fide historian. But a few years ago, he said if he included himself, he only knew of 7 bona fide scholars in the world who thought Jesus did not exist. Now, that might be a couple of more now. Who knows? Might be less. But hardly anyone thinks that. I can tell you for certain that there are more credentialed scientists who believe the earth and the universe are 15,000 years old or less than there are credentialed historians who think that Jesus never existed. So some of the evidence, historians look for things like, do you have any unsympathetic sources? Yep, we do. We've got Josephus, we have Tacitus, we have Lucian, we have Mara bar Serapion, we have other Jewish sources like the Talmud. They mention Jesus. So you've got these non-Christian sources. Now, some will say, some skeptics will say, well, they just got their information from the Christians. Really? So you have Tacitus, who's a Roman historian, and in what he writes about Jesus, it's not positive. What he writes about Christians, he says it's an evil and mischievous superstition. So he has some very low thoughts about Christians. Why would he go to Christian sources and mention Jesus? It wouldn't make any sense at all. Josephus was growing up in Jerusalem. He was born about 7 years after Jesus died. He's grown up in Jerusalem where the apostles would have been preaching about Jesus. He's grown up, his father is a very popular priest in Jerusalem named Matthias. So this places Josephus geographically and chronologically at the time where Jesus' disciples would have been proclaiming his teachings, his death, and his resurrection. And Josephus mentions him later on. It's a disputed passage. He mentions him in 2 passages. One is not disputed. He mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, the Messiah. How do you have a brother of someone who never existed? And then he's got another passage, which there is question about it, and it does appear that a Christian later doctored up the text and added to it and made it sound more laudatory of Jesus than what Josephus actually wrote. but by far the majority of Josephus specialists say that Josephus mentions Jesus here. So, and then you've got Mara Bar Serapion, who is a prisoner, and he's writing from prison to his son, and he's talking about how Jesus had been executed, how the Jews had Jesus executed. Why would he mention a fictitious character who had probably lived within 100 years of when he's writing to his son? So you've got these unsympathetic, non-Christian, even some of them like Tacitus and Lucian were hostile to Christians. They mention it. Historians also look for early sources. So they have things like, we've got early sources like Paul. The Apostle Paul mentions Jesus as a historical person. Paul even said he knew James, the brother of Jesus. So, it's not like Jesus is a character who's situated in the distant past for which we couldn't know if he existed. You've got Paul, who knew the brother of Jesus, and he's talking about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus just a few years after it allegedly happened. And Paul is growing in a status within Judaism. He's as a Pharisee. He may very well have been at Jesus's trial. He may very well have seen Jesus executed. We don't know, but there was a reason he was persecuting the church. He knew Jesus's teachings. He was an enemy of Jesus. How would you be an enemy of someone who had existed during your lifetime in the same place you had been, but had been just a fictitious character? I really don't think these skeptics think through their position and see how ridiculous it is. So we have early sources. We've got eyewitness sources, or at least sources that are rooted in eyewitness testimony. So take, for example, the Gospel of Mark. I have a student over here doing his master's. He's just finished his thesis, turned it in to me 2 weeks ago. He has surveyed where critical scholars writing on Mark since 1965. He found 207 of them in the English language, that is. So if you looked at things like your own language, if you looked at Finnish, if you looked at German, Korean, all these other languages, French, most are writing in English today. But if you take all the other languages, that might change the results some. But in terms of the majority of New Testament scholars who are writing in English since 1964, 207 of them, the majority of them who comment on it, do think that Mark got his information directly from the Apostle Peter. So, and they're mentioning the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, his miracles. John's Gospel, the majority of scholars today do not think that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote John's Gospel, but they do think that the author's primary source was one of Jesus's disciples who had walked with him and who is providing eyewitness testimony. So we've got at least 2 accounts. That's not even talking about Luke and Matthew, but just at least 2 accounts that are rooted in eyewitness testimony. You've got Paul's early account, and Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 mentions oral tradition that dates back even earlier and comes from the Jerusalem apostles, and they mention Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. So it's early, it's multiply attested by independent sources, it's attested by unsympathetic sources. We've got really good evidence that Jesus existed. It's just crazy for people to even question it.
So you always meet people that say that this is not good enough. I want stronger arguments. And what do you think about the history of antiquities? How much would we know about that history if we raise the bar above the standard of what we have in the Gospels about Jesus? So if we say that that is not enough, how much do you think we would know about the antiquities?
That's a very, very good question, Jesper, or good point you're making, actually. If you're going to come at the scriptures and be that skeptical, then you have to be skeptical of all ancient literature as well, if you're going to be consistent. And then there's going to be very little that we can establish. Last year, I did just for the fun of it. Sometimes I've heard it claimed that the evidence for Jesus's resurrection is better than we have for Caesar's crossing the Rubicon. And I thought, I've heard that a couple of times, and I thought, is that true? So I looked at the evidence for it. And the bottom line, I don't think it's better. But I mean, nobody questions whether Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The evidence is more than sufficient that he did. And the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I think, is every bit as good as we have for Caesar's crossing the Rubicon. The only reason someone wouldn't believe it is because they can't stomach the thought of miracles, because it challenges their worldview. So it's not a matter of poor evidence. It's a matter of worldview, that they don't like the idea of miracles or resurrection for whatever reason. And so they reject the gospel accounts, or the historicity of Jesus. And if a person says, well, the evidence isn't good enough, say, well, okay, well, prove to me that you exist. Well, I'm here before you. I know, but sometimes I could be experiencing a hallucination, or maybe I'm just having a dream. I can't even know that I'm really experiencing you. So prove to me that you exist. Well, I've got a birth certificate. Well, birth certificates can be forged. And maybe the person was pulling a joke on your parents and switched babies, and you're not even who you really think you are. And your parents aren't who you think who they think you are. How do we know? Prove to me that you exist. And any reason that that person can give can be answered. Well, look, let's get a couple other people and let's see if they can see affirm that I exist. Hey, let's get 5 other people. Okay, so there's 6 people here now, and they can all see me. Therefore, I must exist. Well, how do I know I'm not experiencing some sort of a group hallucination? You could give all the same kinds of pushback that skeptics give about Jesus, or just give any kind of historical figure of the past. Because there are even historians today who deny the Holocaust. There are people who deny that we ever walked on the moon. There is a flat earth society out there with a couple of 100,000 followers. So you can see how gullible people are. The thing is, when a person gets like that, we don't have to play by their rules or say, well, I'm going to adopt your burden of proof. I had a guy say to me once, he was saying, he came up to me, I was speaking at Clemson University, which is a very reputable university here in the US. Their football team has won the championship several times. So they, after I lectured, one of the students, a bunch of students came up, they were asking me questions, and one student was given all these objections and, oh, how do we know? And how do we know? We just can't know. There could be all these other things. And so I said to him, well, how do you know that you're not a brain in a vat being stimulated with electricity by a mad scientist to have the perceptions that you're having right now, but actually you don't exist as you think you do? In fact, how do you know we're not even actually having this conversation? You're just, the thoughts have been put into your mind to think that we are. And he says, well, I can't know. And I say, well, then our conversation really is meaningless and I'm wasting my time talking to you. And I turned to the next person and took their question. I mean, this is just how ridiculous some people can be in requiring the amount of evidence that they are. They just show that they don't want to believe. And if that's the case, they're welcome not to believe. But we don't have to subject ourselves to such crazy burden of proof.
So if we just deal with the New Testament as a number of old manuscripts and look at the differences and try to find what is authentic, what is original. And I could say that I and Mike have not tested our questions on each other, so I'm a bit curious what you will say about this. But when I read a guy like Craig Bloomberg, he said that the New Testament is authentic to 97 to 99%. That is, say that one could establish beyond a reasonable doubt that this was the authors have written. Could you comment on that?
Yes, I mean, I'm friends with Blomberg. I'm also friends with Dan Wallace. Dan Wallace is an expert in textual criticism. In fact, years ago, Bruce Metzger at Princeton, one of the leading textual critics of the world at that time, told Dan Wallace that he regarded Dan and Bart Ehrman to be the two leading textual critics in North America. So Dan Wallace really knows his stuff with textual criticism. And he talks about how the text of the New Testament we have is extremely pure to what an original text would have said. Now, with that in mind, I would make two major comments here. The first one, which is the most important, is that would at best show that the text that we have is what was originally written, but it would not say anything about the truth of what is written. All right. I could have the original text of Shakespeare in my hand, Shakespeare's Hamlet, but it doesn't mean that Shakespeare's Hamlet is true. All right. So that's one thing. Another thing is it gets a little more complex when you think it is possible that there were various editions. So it could very well be the case that there were 2 or more editions of John. Maybe the story about the woman caught in adultery wasn't in the original one, but John added it a decade later or something like that. It could be that there were a couple of editions of Mark. Maybe Mark had a draft. It was common in antiquity for the draft to float around before the final came out. Maybe someone had the draft. Maybe there was the final, and then a few years later, Mark said, hey, I don't like the way I said this one thing grammatically. Let me change that. And so he came out with a revised edition. So when we talk about having the originals, which one are we talking about? Are we talking about the second edition or the first edition or the draft? We've got a similar kind of problem with the Old Testament because in the 4th century BC, the Old Testament was translated into Greek, from Hebrew to Greek. And when the Old Testament is quoted in the New Testament, sometimes we find different versions of it, even in the Greek. So we believe it's divinely inspired, but then you'd say, okay, well, which one? Is it this version of the Septuagint, or is it this version of the Septuagint, or is it the Hebrew? Which one? And you're saying, well, which one is it necessary to be preserved? So it becomes a little more dicey or a little more complex than just saying, well, we've got the originals, okay? Or we can go back to we can get a text that's very early, I think we can say, and may very, very well be the original. But it doesn't tell us whether we're reading a second edition, a first edition, or a draft. That's what those manuscripts are taking us back to. And that could be why there's some differences that can't be resolved.
But if we compare all the different or the variants that we have, we still have a very high percentage of similarity, and that is what we could think of the author route. And I think that just to point to that, what we have is what the author wrote to a very, very high degree, is to encourage people to read by themselves, and in that case be able to read something that is from people that has been with Jesus, and then they could make their own picture of who Jesus is. I think is a good argument.
Yeah. And the things that I'm pointing out here are just minor things. Okay. I'm just trying to be really accurate with my caveats. Whether it's a draft or first or second edition, the essence, the teachings of what is said are still there. They're preserved in their integrity. It doesn't really change things. I mean, Mark is not going to write something and then in a revised edition, he might add some details or change something, but he's not going to change the story to say, it's not going to be from Jesus did not heal the man with the withered hand to Jesus healed the man with the withered hand. These are just going to be minor, non-important changes, if any. So the bottom line, I agree with you. I agree with Blomberg. The text that we have, we can have very good confidence that what we are reading in our biblical texts today is essentially what was written.
A last question when it comes to the text and when you're mentioning Mark. So Mark is the only gospel of the four gospels that are only that mentioning the high priest as the high priest, not the high priest Caiaphas. And some scholars have made comments that this has to be written, or that part of the gospel has to be written before Caiaphas, or during the time that Caiaphas was the high priest. What do you think that is a strong argument for a very early Mark?
I think it's possible. I don't think we can know for sure. So we do find some interesting things like that, and that can be used to. You can form hypotheses like that. It's just no way to prove it.
Okay, yeah. So Caiaphas was a high priest until 37 AD, I think. So that's extremely early, if that's true.
Yeah, there's not too many people who think Mark was written that early.
No.
In fact, the same student that I told you about who did the thing on Mark and authorship, he did it on dating as well. And the majority of scholars do date Mark between the years 50 and 70. And within those that do it by far, most of them put it between 65 and 70. Now, it might have been earlier, it might be later. We just don't know. We really just don't know. We can take guesses. And you're right, when they mentioned about Caiaphas being, or not mentioning the high priest, but just saying the high priest in Mark, that could very well be that Mark was written in the 30s. But it's ultimately unprovable.
Yeah.
Let me give you just one kind of little example so that you see what I mean. The ancient literature is virtually unanimous that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the Gospel of John. I think there's only two sources that would say someone else did, and they're both like Gnostic sources. So, but everyone else says it's John, the son of Zebedee. Now, Ben Witherington, a New Testament scholar over here, has proposed that John didn't write it, but that Lazarus did. And the argument he gives is the author of John's gospel is never mentioned, never names himself. He is referred to as the beloved disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Well, the first time that's mentioned in John's gospel, I think it's chapter 10, chapter 9, something like that, where it's referring to Lazarus. And he's referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then after that, we find a disciple that's called the beloved disciple. All right. The love and beloved in Greek is agapetas, like agape, love. And the disciple whom Jesus loved, agape. So it really means the same thing in that sense. So you got the beloved disciple is not mentioned before Lazarus. You got Lazarus called the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then after that, you've got mentioning time after time of the beloved disciple. So he says that makes sense that Lazarus would be the author. Well, very honestly, that makes sense to me. If we didn't have any testimony from the early church that said John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the gospel, I think a lot of people would conclude that Lazarus is the author. But why I reject Witherington's hypothesis is if Lazarus was the author, you think that you would have at least one early church father who mentions it, because it would have had to have been a tradition that was floating around. The disciple that Jesus raised from the dead, the disciple who said, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? That's the disciple Lazarus who wrote the gospel, but no one said that. Everyone was saying it was John, the son of Zebedee. My point is this: we can make some very interesting arguments, like the one that you mentioned about Lazarus, not Lazarus, about Caiaphas and Mark. But we just got to be careful, because that they're not really conclusive.
Mm-hmm. Should we say something about, before we go to the resurrection, to say something about knowing that Jesus died? I think it has, the interest in this has increased a lot the last year, since our Muslim friends say that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that it's only appeared like that. So what confidence could we say, with what confidence could we say that Jesus died on the cross?
Well, you've got people like Bart Ehrman, who is an agnostic bordering on atheism. In fact, sometimes even refers to himself as an atheist. He says that Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the most certain facts of the ancient world. And why is that? Well, you've got even unsympathetic sources like Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Marabar, Serapion, the Talmud. They mention Jesus' death by crucifixion. You've got it mentioned by early sources like Mark, like Paul, multiple independent sources. You have Paul, you have Mark, you have John. Someone could say that Matthew and Luke are familiar with Mark's account. I'm sure they have some independent testimony, but even if you put those out of the way, you've still got Mark, you've got John, you've got Paul for the Christian sources, and then you have all those non-Christian sources, and then you've got embarrassing sources. So when you look at the ancient literature, in the Jewish literature, you find stories of Jewish martyrs, and they're very bold. They will go to their martyrdoms. I won't get into all the descriptions, but they will go to their martyrdoms, basically saying things like, God, I have not forsaken your law. That's what they will say right before they die. Well, what does Jesus say right before he dies? My God, why have you forsaken me? You've got these Jewish martyrs who go very boldly without fear, to their torturous deaths. Jesus, he's in the garden and he wants out of it if possible. He asks God to release him, let the cup pass from him, if at all possible. That would have been hardly encouraging to his disciples, to whom he had just said, if you want to be my disciple, you have to be willing to take up your cross and follow me. And yet when it's time for Jesus to take up his cross, he wants out. He's praying to get out of it if possible. So you've got these embarrassing kind of elements in the story that a Jew, an early Christian, would not have invented. And so they really suggest the authenticity of the accounts, because they're willing to report embarrassing details. The chances of surviving crucifixion are very, very small. We only have one account in antiquity of a person surviving crucifixion. Josephus, during the fall of Jerusalem, near the year 70, he saw 3 of his friends crucified. And so he went to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, and asked as a favor that he would spare their lives. And so Titus did, as a favor to Josephus, ordered that all 3 be removed from the crosses and provided the best medical care whatsoever. In spite of that, 2 of the 3 still died. So the point is, if Jesus had removed from his cross prematurely and medically assisted, his chances of survival were still quite small. The problem, even more, is that there's no evidence whatsoever that Jesus was removed while alive or provided any medical care whatsoever, much less Rome's best. So whereas people on the internet who aren't scholars, they can propose anything they want, because your only credential to post a blog on the internet is you have to be able to breathe. But a historian, a disciplined historian, has to go with the evidence. And given all the evidence we have for Jesus' crucifixion, his death by crucifixion, without evidence to the contrary, the historian must conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him.
Mm.
Now, I suppose a Muslim could come back and say, yeah, but the Quran says that God made it appear that he died on the cross, but instead he healed Jesus and took him to heaven. And so the fact that everyone believed he had died shows that the Quran is correct. Well, I've got an answer for that, a couple of answers. Number one, the Quran refers to the disciples of Jesus as Muslims. Now, we can understand why God would not have any problems deceiving the Jewish leaders who had Jesus crucified. They were his enemies. We don't have any problems thinking that God would have no problems deceiving the Romans who had crucified him. But why would God deceive Jesus's disciples, Muslims, according to the Quran? And as a result, the largest, most powerful religion in the world since the 4th century, even into this present day, and Islam's greatest competitor. Why would he do that when he could have easily clarified it? It seems that that would not have been wise of God to do. And I would ask the Muslim, if he is going to deceive, if God is going to deceive Jesus's disciples, whom the Quran calls as Muslims, how do you know he's not deceiving you?
Mm.
But here's what I think is the strongest refutation for the Quran on this. Quran, Surah 4, verses 150, I think 56 and 57, or 57, 158. Where it says that Jesus didn't die, God made it appear that way and took him to heaven. We can establish historically that Jesus predicted his imminent death. It's reported in multiple independent sources, early sources, embarrassing stories within it, elements in the story. We have every reason to believe that Jesus predicted his imminent death. Now, if Jesus did not die in imminent death, as the Quran says he did not, well, then the Quran is wrong, because that would make Jesus a false prophet. And the Quran calls him a great prophet. But if Jesus did die as he predicted, then the Quran is wrong, because it says he didn't. Either way, whether Jesus died or whether he lived, the Quran is mistaken on this. There's no way out of this for the Muslim except to say that Jesus never predicted his death. And I would say, well, we've got historical evidence that he did. All you have is a book that was written 600 years later and with no eyewitness testimony, but came from a guy who relayed these, who said he got it from an angel. And at first, when he got these revelations, he believed that he was being oppressed by a demon. That's according to the early Islamic literature. So our evidence that he died is a lot better. There's even no comparison between the evidence we have that he died with the Muslim evidence that says that he survived.
Okay, interesting points. So if we should say something about your method, so you have investigated the historicity behind the Christian claim that Jesus died and was resurrected. And some critics may say, what, you use the Bible to prove the Bible. So how does a historian come around this dilemma today? Would you say, we have touched to this question before, but maybe say something about it.
Sure, that's a pretty easy one, actually. I'd say, I don't have to believe that the Quran is divinely inspired in any sense. I could believe that it's 100% man-made and has all kinds of errors in it. I could believe that, and I could still learn historical things from the Quran. For example, there's a surah, a chapter in the Quran where God says to Jesus, "Did you say that you, me, and Mary are all gods?" And Jesus says, "Far be it from me. I never said that. I only said that I am your servant and to worship you." Well, I don't believe that God and Jesus ever had that conversation. But what reading that in the Quran tells me is there were Muslims in the 7th century, early 7th century, who misinterpreted the Catholic high view of Mary as being worshiping Mary and thinking of her as a God. It also tells me that Christians were saying Jesus is God and Muslims were saying he is not. I can learn that, I can know those things as historical facts from the Quran without believing that it's divinely inspired. When the Quran tells the followers of Muhammad to lie in wait for the unbelievers, to ambush and kill them, I don't believe that God ever gave such a commandment to Muhammad. I do think, though, that this tells us, as students of history, that there were battles between Muslims and non-Muslims back in the 7th century. So we can learn things about history, what was going on in the 7th century related to Islam from the Quran without believing that the Quran is divinely inspired or accepting everything that it says. Well, we can do the same thing with the Bible. And in fact, skeptics do this with the Bible all the time. So you'll have people like Bart Ehrman, Gert Lüdemann, John Dominic Crossan, any skeptical scholar you want to come at, Amy Jill Levine, a Jewish scholar, Geza Vermesh, another Jewish scholar, you name it. Alan Siegel, another Jewish scholar, not Christians. They didn't believe the resurrection, but they would still say it's undeniable that Jesus performed deeds in which he astonished crowds that believed he was performing divine miracles and exorcisms. None of them would disagree. All of them would agree that Jesus proclaimed that he had a special relationship with God who had chosen him to usher in his kingdom. They would all agree that Jesus taught in parables. They would all agree that Jesus was crucified on the orders of Pontius Pilate and at the instigation of the Jewish leadership, and that Jesus died as a result of his crucifixion. And they would all agree that Jesus' disciples had a number of experiences after his death in which they thought Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. And they would all agree that a Jewish persecutor of the church named Paul likewise had an experience he interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to him, and it radically transformed his life from a persecutor of the church to one of its most able and aggressive defenders. They would all agree on those things because the evidence supporting them is so good. And they would use the Bible, the New Testament, as their primary source for this stuff. So they don't have to believe it's divinely inspired. They don't have to believe Jesus rose from the dead or that the things that he did that astonished crowds were actually divine miracles, but they say that these things actually happened.
So you mentioned now some facts that nearly all historians agree on, that you call bedrock facts around the death and resurrection of Jesus. So which historical data would you be so sure of that you call them bedrock facts around the death and resurrection of Jesus?
Okay, and when we say bedrock facts, we're saying these are facts for which the evidence is so strong, the supporting evidence is so strong that virtually every scholar, regardless of their background, acknowledge these as being true. They're facts. And so they form the bedrock, the foundation of any hypothesis. Any hypothesis that you build to explain what's going on with Jesus here, what happened, has to account for these facts. They're non-negotiables. That's what we mean by historical bedrock. And then you build upon that bedrock with facts that are not necessarily so strongly evidenced. Okay. So our bedrock facts would be, number one, Jesus's death by crucifixion. We have extremely good evidence for it, and virtually every scholar who studies the subject grants it. There are a few who deny it, but almost everybody. In fact, by my count, there is only like 3, and only one New Testament scholar, only one, who denied that Jesus actually survived his crucifixion, who said that Jesus survived his crucifixion. Only one New Testament scholar who has posited that, of which I'm aware, since 1985. And nobody really even gives her any attention. Her name's Barbara Tearing, and she's one that thinks that Jesus survived his crucifixion. They took him off while alive. They put him in the tomb. They put aloe and other kind of herbs on him, and that healed him. And he went and he married Mary Magdalene, and they went off to France or Germany and got married and have children. She is the only New Testament scholar who claims that. Okay, it's kind of Da Vinci Code stuff. And you'd say that is so crazy. But if aloe and herbs work that well, then why aren't they using them on burn victims and accident victims in hospitals today? They don't bring a person back to life once they've been tortured and executed. All right. So Jesus' death by crucifixion is one. Number 2, and I have 3 of them. Number 2 is that shortly after Jesus' death, a number of his disciples had experiences they were convinced was of the risen Jesus appearing to them. Now, that's not to say that these scholars will say it was the risen Jesus, but they will say, we have enough evidence from what we read in the Gospels, from other sources, that it's very difficult for Christianity to get off the ground if their Messiah was dead. They'd seen him die. How are they getting up? And these disciples who had abandoned him, now they've come back together, and all of a sudden the Christian movement is flourishing after it was almost destroyed. Why are these disciples, if they knew he was dead, why are they going around and proclaiming he's alive and appeared to them, even to the point of enduring torture, imprisonment, persecution, and even death? So they're not lying about it. They might be deceived in some sense, but they're not lying. So they truly believed Jesus rose and appeared to them. And then third, as I mentioned, you've got Paul, a skeptic who persecuted the church, and now he became a Christian because he believed the risen Jesus had appeared to him. And he was willing to suffer continuously and die for that, strongly suggesting that what he was claiming, he truly believed it. Those would be 3 facts that are granted by virtually 100% of all scholars who are studying the subject today, including those of a very skeptical sort.
Mm.
Those 3 virtually indisputable facts.
Mm. Thank you very much. I think that we have discussed now for nearly an hour, and the conclusion of these facts and what we could say about the resurrection more, I think we could go in depth into next week. So what I think we could do more tonight is to get some questions from everybody that has listened quietly now for an hour. And then when we have answered some questions, I think we should make some chat rooms, so we that are here now could discuss in small groups in the language that we choose what has been said here tonight, maybe to get to know some other students or so from other parts of Sweden. So, and then I think we will finish there in the small chat groups. So, if anyone has any questions now to ask Mike, you could either write it in the chat. You could write them in Swedish, and I could ask them in English. Or if you want to, I don't think that we are so many. So if you want to ask them directly, I think that's absolutely fine. So if we just take 5-10 minutes with questions that you want to ask regarding what Mike has said so far, I think it's a good opportunity to ask that now, or write it in the chat. Yes.
If they type it out, I can read it.
Yeah.
If they type it in English. While they're doing that, I'd like to just suggest if anyone is interested, they can go and look me up on YouTube. And I have a YouTube channel. So if they put in my name, Mike Licona, on YouTube, my channel will come up, and we are posting a new short video on Jesus and his resurrection every day, every weekday during the month of April. So they can go back and see what we've done already, and they can subscribe and then hit that little bell alert button so they'll receive an email every time we put up a new video. And for the rest of this month, every weekday, they will be alerted to a new video when we post it. And then next month and in June, we've got a new series coming that I think you may be very interested in.
Okay. So Hugo Sandell, do you want to ask a question? You wrote that you are interested to ask.
Go ahead. Sorry, my light is not too good right now, but sitting in the sun. No, I was just wondering about the Muslim perspective on the crucifixion of Christ, and partly the view of Christ saying that he was going to die in Surah Maryam, the 19th Surah. As I understand that, the Muslim view, they say that, well, in that surah you have first John the Baptist saying that he's going to, well, blessed is the day of my death, blessed is the day of my resurrection, or something like that. Or blessed is the day of my birth, my death, and my resurrection. And then Christ says in the same surah, he says that, but blessed is the day of my birth, my death, and my resurrection. And as I understand, the traditional Muslim view of Christ's life is that he's given birth to by Mary, and then he's not dying on the cross, but he's taking us up to heaven, and then that's what the Quran says. And then afterwards, the Hadith fills in that Christ will return on the final day, and he will abolish Judaism and Christianity, and then he will die after having established the caliphate, the Muslim version of the kingdom of God. And then he will die, and that's the death that Christ is referring to, and then he will be resurrected. So that's how I've seen it, that they fill in this prediction of his death, that it's not a death on the cross, but it's a death after having returned from heaven. So that was just one. It'd just be interesting to hear what you think about that. And then secondly,
well, let me just address that one first. Yeah, now I'm aware that is the Muslim view of when Jesus dies, but Jesus, if we look, I'd have to go back and look at each of his predictions, and there are plenty of them, but he speaks of them in the sense that he is going to die an imminent death. This isn't going to be something that's thousands of years in the future. It's going to be very, very soon within his lifetime. Even when he's having the Last Supper, he breaks the bread. This is my body that is broken for you. This is my blood that is shed for the forgiveness of sins, for the new covenant. And we know that death has to happen. This is explained in Hebrews, that death has to happen in order for the will to be read and everything to be given away. The new covenant comes into place through death. And so when Jesus, he's the Passover lamb, he has to die. So he's predicting that, and he's saying, this is the last time I'm going to be with you. This is the last time I'm going to drink from the cup. So he's very, very clear there that it's an imminent death. It's not something that's going to happen in the distant future. And I know that there are some other texts that are talking about that, where Jesus talks about the imminence of his death. So that won't fly for Muslims.
Cool. So if I understand it correctly, it's kind of like, okay, so, well, based on the biblical predictions of Christ of his death, it's like giving evidence of an imminent death and not a far off death. And
That's right. And I would add that it's not a matter of just trusting the Bible, trusting the New Testament on this.
Yeah.
It is a matter of using historical method to show that Jesus actually did make predictions like this. Mm-hmm. Like I said, it's in Mark. You've got it in Paul. Paul and Luke report the Eucharist sayings almost word for word, which means it was oral tradition that was going around even before Paul wrote that letter to the church at Corinth. So it's very early. It would have been tradition that would have been formulated in Jerusalem by the Jerusalem apostles, by those alleged to have been eyewitnesses. So you've got that. You've got all these other sayings in Mark, the earliest gospel as well. And remember, we got evidence that this is based on the memoirs of Peter, what Peter taught. So you got something else that's rooted in eyewitness testimony. Then you've got the sign of Jonah that talks about Jesus dying, and that's in both Matthew and in Luke, which would mean the Q material. Now, Muslims will say, yeah, but Jonah didn't die in the fish. He was alive and then he came out. But the same Matthew who talks, so it could mean, it is ambiguous there, the sign of Jonah, of course. It could mean that he died or that he survived. But the same Jesus in Matthew who talks about the sign of Jonah is also the same Jesus in Matthew who clearly mentions his impending death and resurrection 3 days later. So the sign of Jonah should certainly be interpreted. In fact, I've got a short video. If you're interested, I've got a short video on my YouTube channel. Just go to my YouTube channel and in the search under my videos, type in sign of Jonah. And I've got that on there. I've even got something about Jesus' death, and I've got a bunch of short videos on this stuff. All right, you had another question, you said.
Yeah, it's a short question. Thanks. Yes, well, we'll see if we can become short on that. So you talked about like why would Christ, or why would God deceive the first followers of Jesus that were Muslims according to the Quran? And yes, like the popular opinion or like the Hadith traditions kind of seems like, well, the first like followers actually believe that Christ didn't die, even that like there are traditions of Peter giving himself as a sacrifice for instead of Christ. But then Paul comes along, and like most Muslims seem to blame Paul for kind of everything, and he's tried to in his hate for the church, he deceives the church to worship Christ, and then he kills himself or something like that.
Yeah.
And when you meet that, what would you respond to those kinds of theories, like blaming Paul for everything?
I'd say that's just silly. What evidence do you have for that? Because we have all good evidence that that is not true. You've got Paul, who said in Galatians chapter 1, which is an undisputed letter of Paul, that 3 years after his conversion, he went up and he met with Peter, spent 15 days with him, and he also saw James, the Lord's brother. So he sees these two. And when it says he visited, met with, stayed with for 15 days, the Greek word there is hysteresis. So he's getting a history of Jesus. He's talking to Peter. I mean, they're doing more. As one old, now deceased New Testament scholar used to say it, you can better believe it that when Paul was up there and spent 15 days with Peter, they were talking about more than the weather. Paul would have been saying, hey, gosh, Peter, you walked with him. You spent his entire ministry with him. What was he like? What did he say? And hey, you tell me about the appearance after he rose from the dead and appeared to you. You tell me about that appearance. I'll tell you about mine. This is the kind of stuff that no doubt would have taken place. And then in Galatians chapter 2, Paul says that 14 years later, he returned up there and he ran the gospel message past the Jerusalem apostles. He calls them the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John. He names them. And he says he ran the gospel message past them to ensure, this is Galatians 2, 1 through 10, to ensure that he was preaching the same thing they were preaching. And he said they added nothing to what I was saying. In other words, fist bump, Paul. Good job, brother. So they're certifying that he's preaching what they're preaching. Now, that's what Paul tells us. We also have the book of Acts, chapter 15, which would seem to verify that. But then we've got the writings of Clement of Rome and Polycarp. Clement of Rome was likely a disciple of the Apostle Peter. Polycarp was likely a disciple of the Apostle John. And they're both writing after Paul had died. So it will be very interesting and valuable to know what they thought of Paul, since Peter and John were their mentors. Well, Clement of Rome places Paul on par with his mentor, Peter, and he refers to them both as the most glorious apostles. And then Polycarp says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. And then he quotes from Paul's letter and calls it part of the sacred scriptures. These are not the kinds of things you would be saying about Paul if he was corrupting Christianity, making it different than what Peter and John had done. It is exactly the kind of things you'd say if Paul was teaching the same things as Peter, James, and John and the Jerusalem apostles had been teaching. The Muslims have nothing to stand on for this, nothing whatsoever. They will quote from the Gospel of Barnabas, which is at best a 14th, 15th century forgery and can be demonstrated to be such. I've got a short video on the Gospel of Barnabas on my YouTube channel. Not Barnabas, Gospel of Barnabas. I've got that on the YouTube channel. It's so weak that even Muslim apologists like Zakir Naik and Ahmadidat, they wouldn't say the Gospel of Barnabas was a fraud, a forgery, but they never affirmed it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Jakob had a question.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Thank you, Michael, and also Jesper, for this nice format. Feels like we're more close like this than if you would have been present in Sweden in a big hall speaking. Kind of weird thing. I'm wondering, what sources do we have on Paul's persecution of Christians? Is there anything outside of Acts, or perhaps if it's mentioned like in some of the letters? And I'm wondering, like, how does one argue for the reliability of that Paul actually was persecuting the Christians? Because otherwise you might think like, yeah, this is like the perfect story to forge, you know. All the Christians can say like, look at Paul, he was persecuting us, and now he turned around, so you should too. Like, so I'm wondering about the sources, there on Paul.
Sure. Well, when it comes to historical work, there's no proving things beyond all doubt. You have to prove things and say, what is more likely here? What's the preponderance of evidence? What does it point to? What seems most likely? So with Paul, we've got his own testimony saying he persecuted the church. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when he calls himself the least of the apostles because he persecuted the church. It's in Philippians, was it chapter 3 perhaps, where he kind of gives his resume of the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised the 8th day of the nation of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church. So in 2 of undisputed letters, at least there's more than that too, but you got 1 Corinthians and Philippians that he eyewitness his own testimony saying he persecuted the church. You've got
the
Luke.
Argument there would be that if he was making this up, people would point it out.
So then why would you have Polycarp, who is a disciple of John, saying that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth? If you'd have to say Polycarp's lying, you'd have to say that John and all of Jesus' disciples agreed to spread this lie around that Paul had been an enemy of the church.
Mm.
Well, now it depends who you're answering here. If you're answering a Muslim, they're not going to claim that, because now you've got to include the disciples in on the lie, right?
Mm.
If you're going to say a skeptic, I'd say, well, what's your evidence for it? Okay, so we're used to just being backed up against the wall by, maybe I shouldn't say that, that's a figure of speech. Do you use that over here?
Yeah.
Okay.
We
They-
are used to it.
Okay, so, we as Christians will allow ourselves to get backed up against a wall in a corner, and we'll allow the skeptic to throw any kind of explanation or objection they want. So I'd say, okay, look, I've got Paul himself saying that he persecuted the church in 1 Corinthians, in Philippians, and even in Galatians chapter 1, verse 23. He said that even though the churches in Judea had not seen him, the report was going around that he who persecuted the church now proclaimed the faith he once sought to destroy. So now he's writing to the Galatians, telling them that he is aware of something, a rumor, a report that's going on about his conversion from persecutor to believer. And this is an indirect thing. So that would be another testimony of Paul saying he did it, and that the story was going around. And then you've got Luke in the book of Acts, who's narrating that. So if you're a skeptic, not a Muslim, but an atheist, a skeptic, and saying, well, Paul and the early Christians just invented that, say, well, what evidence do you have for that? You're talking about a grand conspiracy here. So the burden of proof now is on your shoulders. And put them in the corner. Don't let them just throw objections at you. Say, well, what's your evidence for that? What's your first century evidence for that? I've got Paul saying he converted. I've got the book of Acts, another source, independent of Paul, saying he converted. I've got Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who were disciples of Peter and John, the apostles. And they're saying that Paul was a great guy. He's an honest guy, a great apostle. He taught the truth. All right, so I've got that. It seems that you're either posing here a huge conspiracy in which they lied. And if you're going to say that, I need some evidence from the first century. What is it?
Would any scholar bring any doubts about Paul
No.
on this issue, or it's a non-issue?
It's a non-issue amongst today's scholars.
Okay.
Some scholars question Paul. It used to be among some New Testament scholars up through the 1970s, there were some who would say that Paul invented the kind of Christianity that we have today. But E.P. Sanders kind of laid that to rest in some of his books. And since then, nobody believed, no New Testament scholars, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, whatever, nobody would believe that. Only Muslims are holding that today, and it's based on no evidence whatsoever.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
Oh, I shouldn't say no evidence. There is, in the stuff where there is a folder or a book in which the Gospel of Barnabas was discovered by a monk, and I think it was the 15th century, or it's a 15th century manuscript. And this monk said that he also discovered some lost writings of Irenaeus that said that Paul was a bad guy. Okay, but it's 15th century. Nobody has ever seen this manuscript of which we are aware. We don't have it today, and nobody even could see it back in the 15th century. And all the writings we have of Irenaeus speak of Paul in the most high terms, the most respectful terms. So everything that Irenaeus wrote spoke of Paul in a positive sense. The only so-called evidence we have is someone who said he saw a manuscript that no one else has ever seen of the lost writings of Irenaeus, and that would have to go against everything that Irenaeus says in his known writings. So you can see how far-fetched this gets.
we have one additional question here, and then I would like to use these chat rooms. So one question is, do we have any evidence for that it was 1 week from when Jesus read into Jerusalem on a donkey to his crucifixion? So it's obviously the question of this time span. What do we know about that from when he entered Jerusalem as a king?
Yeah. I haven't really done much work on that. The only thing I've done is I've studied the differences between the gospel accounts. I know that Matthew places the temple cleansing on the day after on the day of Jesus's triumphal entry into Jerusalem, whereas Mark puts it on the day after. And I think Matthew's just simplifying the story, and Mark has 2 temple visits. He rides the donkey into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. He goes into the temple and looks around. Then he spends the night in Bethany, and it's the next day he comes and cleanses the temple. What Matthew does is he takes the temple cleansing on Monday, moves it to Sunday, combines it with the other one just to simplify the story. I mean, why mention he just looked around? You know, he just wants to get to the bottom line, and he does the same with the fig tree. Mark has Jesus cursing the fig tree on Monday and seeing it withered and dead on Tuesday. Matthew has Jesus cursing the fig tree on Monday and it withers on the spot. So he takes this two stages and makes it one. Another difference is you've got Mary, the sister of Lazarus. She anoints Jesus's feet 6 days before Passover, whereas in Mark and in Matthew, it's 2 days before Passover. One of them has moved it. My suspicion is it's John, because John has just told the story about Lazarus. And in fact, he opens the story by saying Lazarus was the sister of Mary who had anointed Jesus's feet. And so then he tells the story of Lazarus dying, coming back to life. And then he follows that immediately with the story of Jesus being anointed by Lazarus' sister Mary. And you've got Quintilian, a Roman rhetorician of the 1st century. You've got Lucian in the middle of the 2nd century, who wrote a book named How to Do History. And they talked about taking narratives and linking the stories together like links in a chain and having overlapping material when possible. So in this case, they are linking the story of Mary with her brother Lazarus. Mary is the overlapping material in both stories. So I think that's what's going on. So you do have some chronological displacement that's going on. But why do they put the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday? I'm not quite sure. You probably have to do just a look at the days that they are talking about. That go between the crucifixion and when Jesus comes into Jerusalem. That would be my guess.